Shall we begin?
That's good, after a quick cough.
Okay, should I get started? Yeah. Hello everyone, I'm Rachel Kavanagh and I head up Greater China for Fleischmann Hillard. Very glad that you can all be here virtually, and I obviously can't see anyone apart from the panelists, but I can feel your dynamic presence out there. So that's very, very good. As most of you will know, PRHK is here to represent, champion, promote and grow the public relations and communications profession in Hong Kong. And our members include agencies, non-agency affiliates and communications professionals like you. We run a number of initiatives aimed at talent and professional development, and we aim to foster high standards and promote the value of the industry and the work of our members by demonstrating best practices both here and globally. Today's topic, when every day brings a fresh crisis, is extremely relevant to the experience we're all facing today. And I know many communications teams are having new areas of their skills tested as brands and organizations change to the rapidly evolving situation. We're delighted to have a great panel of speakers: Angela Hoy, Director Edelman, Adam Wildeck, who's Senior Director BCW, and Mark Sparrow, who is Chair of PRHK and also General Manager of the Hoffman Agency. And they're going to spend the next 40 or so minutes discussing questions around this topic, and then we'll leave you around 15 to 20 minutes of questions. So please do submit via the chat and question facility on Zoom. So without further ado, I wanted to start by saying, Hong Kong's response to COVID-19 began in January after the Lunar New Year, and it's now mid-April. It's now, almost 10 weeks. Mark, how does the communications work you're doing for clients now compared to then? How's the work evolved and changed, particularly given your portfolio of technology clients?
Sure. I think there's a general principle of communications that's just been useful throughout the entire period that, we as communicators have been managing a response for brands to this pandemic. And that's, for communications to be precise, clear, human, and to demonstrate empathy. But, in terms of how that kind of panned out with clients, I think initially when we came back after Chinese New Year, many clients were adopting a kind of wait and see attitude, just to see how the situation unfolded. And then we've seen different areas, different groups of our clients kind of needing to respond differently to the very kind of unique circumstances that they find themselves in. We manage the communications for some ride hailing services, food delivery, home sharing, and these are types of businesses that have been heavily affected by the pandemic, and also to some degree involved in a response to their communities. And I guess the go-to crisis management playbook has very much been in use for those kind of clients, and we can discuss some of those details later on, I guess. On the other side of things, we manage a lot of companies that are involved in the data center space, hardware, software, services. And right now, those types of businesses are one of the few kind of active areas of the economy, kind of powering the bits of business that are happening, such as webinars like this. And, for those types of clients, they need to educate and inform people as the whole globe adopts to new ways of working and coping with what's going on. And so the job for those has been very different. It's about kind of, well, like I said, educating, informing, not wanting to seem opportunistic. And we move there into another thing I think that's worth mentioning here, that in times of crisis, you typically see the communications team work very directly with operational teams, sales, finance, customer support. And I think for every brand right now, the comms needs to be closely connected to the operations. So, with those data center clients, it's also a matter of seeing what we can do operationally to support users, you know, and that includes kind of offers, includes freemium models, includes reduced subscriptions, because I think right now it's not enough to communicate, you also have to do.
Yeah, that's a very good message. Adam, for your clients, what are the main activities that you're doing for them, and how has that changed, if at all?
It's an interesting question. I mean, Hong Kong is in a particularly unique position. Effectively, many of the clients that we've been working with, I'd say over the last 9 months, have been on somewhat of a crisis footing ever since June or July last year, when the Hong Kong protests started to become a major issue. And we've been working with a number of our clients on managing the kind of geopolitical sensitivities around the Hong Kong protests for a long period of time. And I think what I've noticed is there's been this shift from that type of crisis, that kind of geopolitical sensitive crisis, to the pandemic. A lot of them are far more used to dealing or working on a crisis footing than they had been previously. That being said, the shift has been very much operational. I think Mark just mentioned that before. The way that this crisis is impacting businesses is fundamentally different. It's not so much the sensitivities that they're worrying about, it's how they actually manage their operations. A lot of the work that we've been doing with clients since January have been a lot of internal communication messages, making sure that all of their employees are clearly understanding health and safety measures that are being put in place, new protocols. And I think that is probably the first and most important element that a lot of the clients we've been working with have been focusing on. And now it's starting to shift to, well, how can we make sure that we are doing our bit? And you know, consumers, there's been various studies done, but consumers overwhelmingly are expecting brands to make some form of a contribution to this. So shifting from that, you know, operational management, ensuring that their staff and their employees are doing the right thing, that they understand the new protocols, now looking at how they can connect better with their consumers and demonstrate to their consumers that they're a responsible you know, corporate citizen, and that they're making a contribution to this fight against the pandemic. So I think that's been the biggest shift that we've seen.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. Angela, in terms of this shift that Adam and Mark were describing, are you seeing that with your clients as well? And are people really getting back to normal in terms of the type of work that they're doing, or is this just a myth?
Yeah, I think I totally echo with what Mark and Adam said about, you know, all the changes in terms of our client counseling. I think that, you know, well, Hong Kong, I think that we're very blessed that we are actually kind of moved away from the most difficult part of the situations. And we actually got quite a lot, like, you know, queries from clients or colleagues from all different markets about how we actually help clients to offer support, you know, during the peak of the epidemic. I think that's something that we're actually now being the advisor to our colleagues in other parts of the world. But I think that, you know, with the full recovery, still a long way to go. I think actually some of the clients have started to think about the recovery phase, how they are going to use their positioning or their reputation to help restore the confidence with different stakeholders, not only with the media, but with like general consumers. I think that's kind of, you know, a role that actually us as a comms advisor can play to help clients to think about, you know, what would be the opportunity they can help to support the community to go back to a new normal. I think after the epidemic, I don't think that we'll go back to, you know, the way that we work and then to live. I think the new normal actually gives us a lot of opportunities in terms of communications, because I think in Hong Kong, we're so used to doing a lot of things face to face. But now that with the situations has actually forced us to adopt like more new ideas, you know, doing announcements via virtual connections or trying new ways of engaging your consumers or customers. So I think I'm trying to be hopeful and then be optimistic about how we actually can kind of like, you know, change our role to kind of adopt a new normal. But, you know, we're not going to live the same way again.
Yeah, I think when people say go back to work, they should go, it's not about going back to work, but go forward to new possibilities, isn't it?
That's
because
right.
It is a very, very different world. Mark, I mean, Angela's talked about quite an optimistic view of going back, but I know a lot of clients are still very much in the crisis mode, and they're not used to that. How are you helping them, perhaps particularly their internal comms people, sort of manage the situation and learn new skills themselves, having maybe been product managers, having to suddenly do crisis work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two aspects to that question. You know, I mean, first of all, kind of getting through the crisis and what comes next. You know, I think Angela kind of indicated it there. You know, and Nike came out very early on and kind of laid out what they saw as their global strategy to deal with the evolving situation, which was kind of containment, recovery, new normal, expansion and growth again. And, you know, we're working with a number of clients who are looking at this evolving situation to see how their communications needs are going to be aligned as the brand goes through that journey, both kind of in the local Hong Kong market and also in other markets across the region as things move at different speeds. Then I think in terms of the broader services, you know, the type of support that we're providing right now, I mentioned the ongoing crisis support for some brands or issues management, where we've got kind of a fast evolving situation that continues to go on. You know, we've got other clients where the job is a bit more straightforward. I meant to mention some of our kind of, you know, enterprise technology clients, and the enterprise technology media and enterprise technology audience is still working. They're still consuming content. You know, so to some degree, you know, we're providing that content and reshaping it to make sure that what we're saying is sensitive to the times that we're in. You know, and then there's other brands where it's not necessarily appropriate to communicate too much at this moment in time, because, you know, there are other actors right now in different areas that have a contribution to make, whereas some other brands might not. And for those brands, you know, we're kind of actually helping them to retouch a lot of the corporate communications materials that we never normally get time to do. You know, things like web copy, things like standard marketing materials. You know, right now is a useful time to kind of look at all the assets you have and to kind of give them a lick of paint if that's needed. With other brands, as Adam indicated as well, we're supporting them with internal communications. And so, you know, ordinarily, I guess as an agency, you know, as a specialist tech agency, a lot of our work is usually focused on, you know, kind of educating audiences, business and consumer, on new applications of technology and encouraging adoption. Whereas now our services, I guess, have kind of evolved to provide a much broader spread of, you know, corporate communication services, you know, kind of what you would expect from I guess, any decent kind of international communications agency. But the focus has definitely switched to broader corporate comms requirements.
Yeah. Adam, I mean, you do a lot of sort of corporate comms and crisis work. And, you know, you talked about the Hong Kong situation, the obviously the civil unrest and then followed by the pandemic. How decoupled do you think Hong Kong can be from the rest of the world in terms of its exposure to this particular pandemic from a business perspective? You know, obviously we're the bridge between China and the Western international community. And do you think we're going to get a second wave, if you like, of business challenges, not even you know, pandemic challenges, but business challenges, as the rest of the world and China catches up with what the real impacts are of this particular issue?
I mean, instinctively, I don't think that Hong Kong can be decoupled from the rest of the world. And I mean, if you look at Hong Kong's position as a global city, as a financial hub, this is a place where multinationals set up shop, operate across Asia, and they're on the doorstep of China. So I don't think there's any way that they can necessarily decouple. I mean, I think this second wave that you talked about is already being experienced in Hong Kong. But that being said, and I was having a discussion with my colleague this morning, you know, we're already seeing green shoots in China across the mainland as their recovery has already begun. And, you know, I think there are businesses in China getting back to normal, trying to do everything they can to get back to normal. And I mean, that's a positive sign for their economy, and it's a positive sign for Hong Kong's economy. Hong Kong's economy is ultimately linked to the success of China as it is to the rest of the world. So I don't really think we can be decoupled. I mean, I think the issues that we face are slightly different from a domestic point of view here. I think we've got the experience now of having gone through that period of civil unrest. And I think that Hong Kong obviously has dealt with SARS before, and that's put them on an even stronger footing. So I think, you know, you saw the community response immediately when this COVID-19 outbreak began. They were very, very quick to it, and I think you can see that in the results in Hong Kong. So I think Hong Kong, if you look at Hong Kong as a community itself, they've done a remarkable job of containing this particular crisis. But in terms of how decoupled they can be from the rest of the world, I don't think so. I think they face the same types of communications challenges that their counterparts in the US face, in Europe and China. I think that they're all dealing with the same thing. What I do think, though, for Hong Kong is I think they'll start to, and I'm fairly confident in this, they will start to get back onto a business as usual footing, perhaps sooner than the US and Europe. And I think we're already starting to see that. And a lot of the work that we are doing with clients, and I think Mark and Angela have already alluded to this, is preparing them to get back to business as normal. And there's a big internal message there. How do you do that? You know, what are the practical implications of getting back to business as usual? How do you communicate that to your staff? How do you make sure they feel comfortable returning to standard operations? How do you make your consumers feel that things are returning to normal? How do you encourage them to start going back to, you know, life as it once was? Whether it will ever be the same, it's too early to say. But I think that's probably the message I would say.
Angela, you know, we talked a lot about the learnings of China. What do you think the learnings are for organizations in US and Europe? What are some of the things that you're talking about with your colleagues and clients and in other parts of the world?
I think like what we have been deal with other situation, I think understanding the local market landscapes is always the key. Because I think obviously everyone knows that, you know, Chinese culture is very different from other parts of the world. Even Hong Kong and Chinese culture is also quite different too. So I think for us, when we advise clients, which are kind of like wanting to know more about what's going on in China or in APAC, I think that it's very important to have to collect the local insights, and then to kind of like advise them what would be the impact on, you know, their positioning in China or in Hong Kong, and then how does it affect, like, you know, the reputation elsewhere. So I think that is something that we have been doing quite a lot. So I think that would always be the case. I think it just now, you know, with what we're doing is more connected with what happening elsewhere. I think that, you know, the insight that we collect for each client for a different industry is more important. Another point, actually, I wanted to go back to what Adam said is there's no way that we can decouple from the world's development. And also this is the chance that this is the time actually we see more integrations of comms work with other parts of operations in many industry. And I really hope that this norm will still be the same, because I think a lot of us, you know, working in the communication area in-house or on the agency side, we always feel that, you know, there's always a misconnections between the comms and then the operation. But now that I think that with this challenge brought by the epidemic, people really feel like that, you know, comms is actually an integral part of every part of business. And, you know, the way that we communicate with our own stakeholders will also affect the outlook of the business. So I think that's something that I hope people will still keep in mind when we come to survive from this epidemic. Yeah.
Mark, there's been a lot of discussion around you know, employee communication and how important that is. But it seems to me one of the biggest challenges is communication to consumers at this time. Obviously, one of the areas that people are doing is communicating to them, you know, how the organisation is supporting the community through this crisis. But there have been some organisations who've been tone deaf and who've got it really, really wrong. What's your advice to those organisations? What could they do differently?
I mean, I think right now, as we're still kind of in the containment phase, and we're not yet out the other side, although we're starting to hear talk of exit plans across the world there in terms of how we move to the next phase. But I just think right now it's just important to be appropriate and relevant, because I think otherwise you're going to irritate people. You know, I mean, as a consumer myself, you know, when this first kind of started to emerge in Hong Kong, and we went through that first phase of remote working. What I don't need is a brand reminding me to wash my hands, you know, and I think there was a lot of kind of brands that were trying to say something when they'd have been better off kind of staying quiet unless they had something concrete to contribute. And that goes back to the point I was saying earlier about, you know, it's not enough to communicate, you also need to do. And, you know, we've seen examples of kind of like some global consumer brands doing the right thing. You know, I think of LVMH, that's kind of like changed one of its plants to produce hand sanitizer. You know, there's areas of Hong Kong Science Park that have been dedicated space to the production of masks and other equipment needed by healthcare workers. And I think those are the brands that we want to hear from right now. And, you know, if you don't have something to contribute, then, you know, I think you are better advised to kind of plan what you do next once consumers are receptive again to hearing from brands more generally.
But how do you know when that is? Because that's obviously different for different industries and different demographics. Angela, or do you have a perspective on that? How do you know when it's the right time to engage?
It's always hard to say that, you know, whether you did the right job after you get some compliments from, you know, your stakeholders. But I think instead of like doing everything in one go, I think it's actually good to kind of like sometimes use a pilot program or some of the messages to kind of test the water, not only with your internal stakeholders, but with the external market. But I think that now that, because going back to, you know, the topics of today, that every day can be a crisis. So I think you can't assume that, you know, we just do one campaign today in a big band and tomorrow that, you know, people would compliment what you have done. So I think that, you know, now that we just have to be very cautious of kind of picking the right stakeholders and messages to kind of start something small, and then before we roll out to the public. I think this will probably help us to protect our brand, because the unknowns is always out there, and we're just living in a bigger like unknown world nowadays.
It seems. Oh, go for it. Yeah.
I just wanted to pick up on the last point, the last question that you asked, Rachel. I think for me, it's less a question of when and more a question of how. How you should communicate and what you should communicate on. And I think Mark nailed it earlier. You're relevant. Don't be seen to be opportunistic. And, you know, we've all seen examples where brands have just got it wrong on their messaging or wrong on their attempted contributions. I mean, I think brands should look to try and focus on what is their unique positioning where they can make a contribution. What are the things that they can do? And Mark talked about LVMH, classic example. You know, they were ready kind of positioned to pivot, turn their operations into something that's making a substantial contribution to this fight against this pandemic. Our global head of CSR, I think she summed it up beautifully. She said, give until it hurts a little. Now, I mean, LVMH, which is in the luxury industry right now, they're hurting already, and yet they were still prepared to make this substantial contribution. I mean, I think that they would be hurting a lot, and yet they still did this. That's why it's been perceived so well. I think from a practical point of view, if you look at the things, they've started turning some of their production facilities into mask making factories now as well. So they've done hand sanitizing, now doing masks. A crass way of doing it would be to make masks and put a little logo on it, an Louis Vuitton logo on it. That would not sit well, but they've done it well. They're unbranded, they're being put out, they're not for sale, donated. These are the ways that I think brands need to be thinking about it. So it's not so much a question of when, it's more a question of how, in my view.
So just taking your example of the luxury industry, I was just reading the other day that in fact Hermes had a phenomenal sale in their Guangdong store, selling around 2 million of exclusive luxury items. So obviously there is an appetite for that in some way. Why do you think they can be successful doing that and other brands are not successful?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I haven't seen the article, and I couldn't really comment on how they're doing broadly across the world. I suspect that you know, the Chinese luxury market is incredibly robust, and you know, I have read that they continue to maintain a decent degree of sales across the China market. I don't think that they would be doing as well across Europe and America right now. But you know, I think that brands who can demonstrate a good contribution now will benefit in the future, and this is a long-term goodwill exercise that the brands that do the right thing now will benefit from in years and decades to come. That's my belief.
Angela, I think you were nodding there as if you had something to say.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm thinking, of course, like Hermes is a, you know, the case studies that you mentioned on Hermes is extremely interesting. But I'm also thinking about what other smaller brands can do, and how much that they can take part in kind of demonstrating the commitment to the community. So I think that's something that I'm quite interested in, because I feel like that every small and mid-sized company, they do have their role to play. And actually in Hong Kong, a bulk of our economy is actually was contributed by SMEs, but obviously they suffered quite a lot because of the economic downturn. So is there any way that actually other brands can help with, you know, smaller brands to come up with a strong motivation and initiative to help the industry? I think that's some of the challenges, opportunities that company can actually leverage. Yeah, but I think that's the success of Hermes is quite hard to replicate in other parts of the world, not even in Hong Kong. But what other big brands can actually help to revive the whole industry in the current situation is something I think it's quite worth to explore.
Mark, we're, you know, now mid-April, as the title of this session is Every Day is a Crisis, but what do you see unfolding over the next, say, 3 to 6 months? What picture would you like to paint? And I'll ask each of you this question to see what variation we get. So Mark, starting with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've covered some of the points already, so I'm gonna, I guess, like wrap some of those up to respond to that particular question. And I think, you know, from a broader economic political situation now, we're slowly starting to see a discussion about how economies manage themselves out of this lockdown mode. And, you know, many of the discussions I read suggest that the likely approach to revive economies and slowly return to normal is going to be gradually easing restrictions. So we won't return to full economic activity. There'll be a gradual easing. So, you know, it's going to involve mandatory wearing of masks, perhaps. It's going to involve mandatory social distancing, you know, kind of a measure that we have in Hong Kong right now, where restaurants, I think, can only be 50% occupied, so that you've got the social distancing while people go about their daily lives. And I think we'll see governments across the world beginning to consider which of those tools and methodologies they think it's reasonable to deploy in order for economic activity to start kicking back in. And so then your duty kind of in communications for the client becomes one of considering where does your brand sit in that new landscape, which is just over the hill, I think. I also hope. You know, and kind of course, you know, the response is going to be different for every brand, but kind of, I think what that situation I've just described, you know, an easing of restrictions rather than kind of, you know, a full release and return to normal, that's likely to last for a considerable amount of time. And so, you know, communications now should be looking at what do we do? It's to Adam's point, how do we communicate when that time arrives, because all brands then will need to resume their communications, I guess, in a full manner, whereas it might not always be appropriate for some brands right now.
Yep. Adam, What's your view of the world in the next in Hong Kong in the next 3 to 6 months?
Me, I mean, the central question is how far away is a vaccine? That really determines the course of the next couple of years. And I mean, in a world where a vaccine is found, let's say in the next 9 to 12 months, I think things go back to normal pretty quickly after that. If it takes 2, 3, 4 years, I think what you're going to see is, I think that the term that they've used is the hammer and dance, where you have these kind of rolling restrictions that are imposed for a few weeks at a time, then they're relaxed, then they're imposed again, and they're relaxed. And if that becomes the new normal, brands are going to have to really think about how they operate in that type of environment, where 1 week the retail stores may be open or the restaurants might be open, next week they might be closed. How do you communicate effectively with your consumers in that kind of an environment? Very tricky. And I think we are already starting as communications professionals to think about that, because we've been dealing with it now for a little while. I think that type of environment will be a fundamentally different mode of operation to what people are used to, and I think communications tactics will need to adopt that.
Angela, your perspective.
Yeah, of course, my biggest hope is to get the vaccines ready. But I think that part will leave it for the healthcare professionals to deal with. But I think for us as a communicator, of course, we see quite a lot of clients that were quite scrambled to activate their BCP plan or other operational changes to cope with the new normal. I think what we see is actually clients might need to rethink about how they're going to reposition themselves in the new phase, how they're going to engage with the customer, like what I mentioned earlier, and how the senior leaders of every company actually would be the leading examples of trying to help rebuild some of the business or industry. So I think that would be something quite important for the coming 6 to 12 months. I totally agree with Adam that we're going to live in a mode of relaxations and reactivations of the pandemic plan again for maybe I think 12 to 18 months. So I think but we still have to keep our life normal and then to get it going. So I think it's just the role that we can play is actually helping clients to be more prepared, and then to cover thinking any other thing else that could happen, because I think that with Hong Kong social movements and then the current epidemic, nothing is impossible right now. Everything can happen. So I think for us, it's time to actually really to revisit all the preparedness plan that we've got in place in terms of communications and making sure our executive can be more prepared to deal with the unknown world.
Can I add a point on
Yes.
following on from what Angela just said? I absolutely agree with that, and I think agencies here have a vital role to play as that external pair of eyes. Kind of ordinarily, right, the nature of the job is often very kind of focused on short-term delivery and what needs to happen quickly. But the role of agencies ordinarily is to kind of step back and take a longer term view about where we're moving as a brand over 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. And I think that kind of consultancy and that kind of consideration about where an organization needs to go with its communications is particularly valuable right now, when a lot of clients are kind of caught up in just managing the day-to-day of their response to the crisis and the pandemic. So I do think we've got an important role to play there.
So do you think, in fact, and it has been hinted through this, but the whole area of public relations will be elevated in terms of its value to an organisation? And are we already seeing this?
I think we are, because it's related to the point I made a moment ago that how a brand responds right now is going to involve with operations, and communicators are being brought into that process to discuss how that's going to be expressed, whether the approach needs to be modified, who needs to be informed. And I think many of us in those roles are showing the contribution we can make to effective management of the business. I think we've all been in places, previously, before the pandemic, where we've looked at something a brand has signed off and wondered how it could have ever, got through the approval process. But I think with many communicators now being involved in managing the articulation of a brand's response, I think a lot of us are proving our value and the contribution that we can make in showing that these things can be dealt with smoothly and effectively, and the impact can be mitigated, managed, and reach the people that we want to reach. So I see the shift happening, and I would hope, and that's probably too much to expect, that those habits that are kind of taking shape now remain once things start to return to some semblance of normality.
Adam, leadership is something that we haven't discussed, but in terms of the Hong Kong situation, are there any leaders you think are doing it particularly well or particularly badly in terms of communicating in this pandemic environment? And what constitutes good leadership too?
Well, I mean, I think that those leaders who have the ability to demonstrate very, very clearly, first and foremost to their own people, that they are being taken care of, that when they say that your health and safety is a priority, it's not just something they have to say, they actually mean it. Leaders who can do that and can get across that message in a way that is believable are the ones who are, I think, doing the best job. And, this is an incredibly stressful time for everybody. I mean, it's not just health-related concerns. The state of the economy is obviously very uncertain at the moment. Leaders who can hold their teams together during times of great uncertainty, they are the ones that are doing the best job. And I mean, I work with some clients who've got some amazing leaders. I think of one of them in particular, which is VF. They have incredibly strong leadership at a global level and at an APAC level. They have done a terrific job across their organisation, helping people feel safe, being flexible, communicating clearly about what steps they're taking, and the top showing that nobody is exempt from feeling a bit of pain. The leadership of that organisation has taken a 50% pay cut. Many of their senior executives have done the same, and they're doing it to protect jobs across the organisation. These are not just comms activities; they are genuine leadership activities, and those types of leaders are the ones who I think will come out of this best.
Yeah. Well, actually, one point I want to add on after Adams is actually in Hong Kong, because with a lot of big companies that's actually family run. Mm-hmm. And you actually see from this current situation, the second generation or third generation of some of the family-run companies, they are actually become quite vocal to kind of explain their firms or their families positioning in helping the community. I think this is quite interesting. The second part is actually with the Hong Kong, with those like startups in fintech, in different areas. Actually, you see actually a lot of unknown business people who were so eager and confident to share how's their plan to help the community to survive from this pandemic. I think they actually demonstrate some very impressive leaderships and a commitment to Hong Kong. So I think that they are very different from all the well-trained seasoned business executives we worked in the past, but they actually can are the new breed of executive, which actually show the leadership's characters to us, and then how they're going to cover tie different groups of people in Hong Kong to get through these situations. So I think these two are quite interesting situation I've seen here in Hong Kong.
Yeah, a new breed of leaders, in fact, coming to the fore, which is always great to see. I'm now going to look at the questions, some of the questions that we've got from panelists, from the general community listening to this. So the first question is, as the needs of clients are now changing and you are all offering different communication services to clients than you have in the past, what does this mean for the skills you require your employees to have now? Do your staff have different skills to service clients, or will you need to hire differently in the future and look out for different skills? Mark, do you want to have a go first at answering this question?
Sure. Actually, I think the type of people that agencies recruit these days, the change happened before the pandemic. I think with the work that we do these days is so diverse. and involves so many different skills and areas, you know, kind of like it needs digital savvy, you know, being able to package content for different channels, understanding how those channels are used by different audiences and different demographics. It needs, of course, there's core skills of communications that will always be there, such as great writing, you know, or organization, solid judgment. But the skills that we increasingly need are, you know, critical thinking and problem solving. And I'm sure, you know, we may have always needed those, but they're particularly important right now. And I think if you're, and they were before the pandemic arrived. So I think if you're hiring new recruits that have that problem solving ability, that are willing to experiment and try new things, is also very important in the work that we do for technology clients, where we're expected to understand what the possibilities are, that, you know, the vanguard of communications technology. I think those are the character kind of strengths that we're looking for. And if we hire people with those strengths, I think they're adaptable to kind of all circumstances that come along, including what we're going through right now.
Adam, anything to add to that?
I mean, I agree with everything Mark just said. The only other point I would add, I think on the whole, most people who work in communications have the ability to be issues and crisis experts. I mean, what I think separates our industry from others is that people who work in comms have an innate understanding of what makes people tick. They've got, you know, they understand what drives consumers' behaviour, and I think that those are the core skills required to be a strong issues or crisis management expert. I've had people, you know, shift around our office coming into my team who have never worked on corporate crises before, and you know, you see them pick it up very, very quickly. You know, there are some core principles that need to be learned. I think on the whole, most comms people are well positioned to manage issues and crisis because it's kind of innate skills that they've got as comms professionals.
Yeah, indeed. So the next question is, what should travel and tourism brands, obviously who've been hit terrifically by this pandemic, be doing now when they have no business and no business opportunities? Do they stay quiet, or do they continue messaging on social media, or do they just focus on how they're supporting their employees and stakeholders? Angela, what's your perspective on that?
I think not only on the tourism and travel industry, there's actually many other sectors who are suffering. I think the general advice is, of course, it's still important to stay connected with your customers. Of course, you know, people understand, you know, how hard the current period will be for every company to survive. But I think if there's still some efforts that brands need to pay on how they are kind of, you know, surviving the business right now, and then how they're going to stay connected with the customers. So I think that's probably, you know, something that they can still do, and they should focus on in the coming few months, despite, you know, all the challenges they have to face.
Yeah. Do you think they should be doing anything together as an industry, or do you think this is like a individual organization by individual organization?
I think it really depends. For me, I think, of course, because the impact is not only on any single company, it's actually on the whole industry. If they can actually really connect together and then work as a one big, like, you know, group to support each other, I think that's very important. But I understand, you know, how complicated, you know, the travel and tourism industry is, and how many big, you know, groups has already exist. But I think if there's any way that, you know, which can actually tie everybody together, I think it's extremely important. And then to show that, you know, the commitments to the whole world. Yeah, but I think at the same time, I think actually most of the travel and tourism companies, they have their own comms plan on CSR, on sustainability. If there's something that they can still continue to share their insight, I think that would be quite nice, other than just focusing on whether, you know, they got a rebound in their bookings or you know, any other, like, you know, marketing offers. So I think, and also one thing is, I think travel and tourism industry in many countries, they employ a lot of people. It's actually very hard, like, to survive without you know, your employees having enough jobs. I think if they can also they use this opportunity to show, to do more with their employees, I think that's another way that they can communicate further.
Yeah, in many ways, their immediate CSR should be with their employee group.
Yeah, exactly.
Mark or Adam, anything to add to that? Any advice for the tourism industry or any other of those that are severely affected by this pandemic?
I mean, all I think I would add is that, sun will rise again for the tourism industry. I mean, I think that everybody watching this panel and everybody on this panel can't wait until they can travel again. And people will travel again. And I mean, I would use this time to, and I think what Angela said and what you said before about protecting their own people is probably the most important objective right now. But tell the stories of your tourism market while you can. You may not be able to travel yet, but there are some really unique stories that you can tell about tourist markets. And when the time is right, when the doors open again, people will be looking at those campaigns and they'll be desperate to travel. I'm one of them. I want to travel again.
I know everyone's going stir crazy.
That's right. Can't wait to bat in the air.
I'd add one thing, and it was just, and it kind of follows on from Adam's point earlier about the how to do it. We saw perhaps a suggestion of the approach that's possible from Time Out, which rebranded as Time In magazine, right? And, shifted its content to kind of discussing entertainment that can be consumed at home. And so if you do it in the right way, consumers, your audiences will be receptive to it. If it's appropriate. It's just when it looks contrived that it jars and provokes a different reaction.
We've been talking a lot about things that organizations are doing right, but one of the questions that we got is, what is the biggest mistake you see corporates making in their communications in general? Not a specific brand so much, but in general. So Mark, any thoughts?
I think I probably referenced it earlier. I think when the situation first started becoming apparent, the consequences and how things might unfold over the coming months, I think there was a scramble among a lot of brands to just put some COVID-19 related content out. And a lot of it was inappropriate and didn't kind of, foster loyalty, didn't foster a positive reaction. And so inappropriate communications was the thing I saw as an individual receiving some of those kind of inappropriate messages.
I think a lot of brands have been talking about purpose though in the last few months and years, especially after, the business roundtable discussion where, a lot of the major corporates in the Fortune 500 made a commitment to purpose and to equal consideration of all stakeholders. Do you think that same purpose is able to exist in the future? I mean, now you've sort of we're over the initial phase of the crisis, but a lot of the really big and difficult decisions need to be made by organizations going forward. And do you think that the purpose and values will come into conflict with the realities of the decisions that need to be made? And any advice from the panel on that front from a communications perspective? Adam.
I mean, if there's any time to demonstrate your purpose, it's surely right now. And some brands and some companies will be in a better financial position to be able to do that and to make a contribution. But I mean, now is the time to really try and live out your purpose. If you're a company that talks a lot about the great work that you do in communities, well, go. Now's the time. And I go back to the point that I made earlier. Give until it hurts a little. Things will. If you can take a long-term view, and if you look at the history of any pandemic, it will pass. We don't yet know how long it's going to take, but it will pass. And if you talked about your purpose before, well, now's the time to demonstrate it. And the brands that are doing that, and we've talked about LVMH a lot here, but that is a classic example. Their business is hurting right now. they're still demonstrating their core purpose. And I think everybody's responded to that very, very well.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing brands that are doing the right thing right now. So I mean, we asked a question earlier about kind of leaders that have impressed, and I saw Microsoft move very early on to kind of commit that they would pay their temporary casual operational staff, you know, cleaners and catering staff and so forth, and they committed very early on to cover their salaries even while they weren't coming into the office. You've got brands behaving like that, and then you've got other brands that are taking a far more kind of ruthless, self-centered really approach. And these are being called out by consumers on social media. And the brands that are seen to be behaving in that way, they're being marked. And I think when, as Adam said, you know, when we will experience a recovery. And when things get back to normal, people will remember the brands that treated them well and the brands that didn't, and it will play out commercially.
Mm. Angela, do you think in Hong Kong there's been a hero brand during this time or a campaign that you think has correctly tapped into consumer sentiment to support the community in the hero campaigns?
I think it's hard to just single pick any that would won the wide acclaim, but I think in the past few months, I think that, you know, well, actually 2 months ago when we were so desperate with hunting the masks everywhere, like, you know, outside the pharmacies and all the outlets, I think actually I feel very warm to see all those, like, you know, communications around some of the local small companies who are kind of doing their best to set up the production lines in Hong Kong, and how they use their own, like, you know, way of telling their passions through their own Facebook channels or through their earned media. I think those guys has been, you know, doing a pretty good job in kind of, like, you know, sharing their compassion. So instead of talking about any single brands, I want to kind of like put, you know, a strong applause to those guys who's been willing to share, you know, how much of hardship they have overcome in helping Hong Kong to produce their own masks, and then and the passion they're going to, you know, get through Hong Kong, to help Hong Kong to get through this difficult period. So actually, I think there's at least 5 to 7 like entrepreneurs who's been so amazing to tell their stories on how they overcome all the challenges. So I think that those are the kind of the lovely story I saw in the market these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Adam, you mentioned, and there's a question now that's relevant to this, about new tools and that are going to be used by communications professionals in the future, potentially. Why do you think PR is an important tool for business right now? And what sort of new things do you think we will be using in the future that perhaps we're not doing now, or maybe using tools differently than we are now?
You know, I can give you one example from a crisis management point of view. Here at BCW, we've got a tool that uses AI to track the likely engagement with a particular news article or a social media post over the next 24 hours. And I'm sure many who are joining this call now are probably familiar with that type of tool. I mean, this is new stuff. This is cutting edge technology that allows us to get ahead of the game. And so if we've seen something that is potentially damaging for one of our clients, we can get ahead of it before it becomes a major issue. I think communications professionals are already, you know, at the cutting edge of that type of technology, and it's becoming increasingly important, particularly, you know, in light of multiple crises that we've just been dealing with here in Hong Kong over the last 9 months. I think comms as a profession right now, I think Mark alluded to this before, people are staying at home a lot more, consuming a lot of content. And you know, we are the industry that helps these brands and these companies develop that content. More content is being consumed now than ever before because people are sitting on their couches, scrolling through their phone or watching TV. We are more important now than we've ever been. That's my firm belief.
We may be, Angela, sorry, you want to?
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
We may be more important, but has COVID-19 affected our clients' budgets? Each of you can give a response to that.
I'll jump out and say undoubtedly. Okay. Undoubtedly. Yeah. I mean, you know, there are, and I think Mark set this up at the beginning. Depending on the sectors that they're operating in, will really ultimately influence it. I mean, people that are in the businesses who are in the pharmaceutical industry or the tech industry, their budgets are increasing. People, businesses who are operating in tourism, retail, their budgets are not going to be the same. And these types of crises impact different sectors in different ways, and some budgets will go up and some budgets will go down. And it's our job as comms professionals to remind businesses and our clients the importance of what we do at this particular point in time, because it will set them up for the future.
So I think from my perspective, of course, the client budget has changed. But one thing I actually see in opportunities is they're more open to hear new ideas and innovative solutions, because they understand that, we can't go back to the old way of doing things, sending out press release, giving calls to a number of the reporters to get coverage. So they all understand that things would change. So they actually are demanding or asking us to be more innovative in coming up ideas of engaging consumers. So I think actually this is a time for us to really help us to sell our new ways of doing things. So for us, again, I think we have to be constantly changing ourselves to adapt to a new world. But I think that, change is not bad. Change is not a bad thing for us.
It's a great message. It's a great message.
Yeah.
Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd bring together a number of the things we just discussed in my response to that. I mean, like, we don't need to speculate on this panel about the kind of commercial impact on the industry. Provoke Media ran an article last week, the week before, which surveyed agency leaders and in-house professionals across the globe that dealt very kind of specifically with some of these questions. We've seen announcements from some of the big holding groups this week about the impact that the pandemic is having. But there's a number of things that I think kind of shift the way that we work, which we could make work when we return to recovery more rewarding and enjoyable for us. And kind of Adam alluded to it. I think we'll see increased automation. In terms of consuming content, there are lots of tools out there where you can automate the distribution of content and the packaging of content through different channels and people's responses to it. I think also we've all got used to a different way of working, right? I mean, we're holding this kind of webinar on Zoom right now, and I think some of the things that we've picked up during this time will stay because they're just more efficient than how we used to do things previously. So I actually think this time of change that we're going through leads us, the industry, to a place where the work's going to be exciting, there's going to be innovation, there's going to be new stuff to try, there's going to be experimentation. And, as we move to that phase, through this containment phase, I'm kind of excited about the stuff that we'll get to try out.
Yeah, that's a great end to this webinar. There's optimism as well as obviously a realistic sense of the future and the long period ahead before we see more certainty in our everyday lives. But certainly for the industry, it's a great time to be innovative, to be strategic, and to be giving counsel at the highest level that really makes an operational difference. I'd like to thank the panelists, Mark, Angela, and Adam, for great insights today, and obviously thank our audience for great questions and for being here. We certainly appreciate your support, and we hope you have found this valuable. And if you have any additional questions, please do fire them to us, and we'll be happy to respond. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.